Hi, everyone. Welcome to Roofless in Colloquium. We're excited that you're joining and welcome back if you've been here before. If you're watching us from the future, we've been doing this like, I think now like 30 or 40 times. I'm going to dive in. This part of the colloquium is recorded. We'll do a presentation and we're going to talk about questions about composition, and we're going to bring three examples. And the reason why we're doing this, it's because during the webinar on Friday, we talked about a list of criteria to follow when we think about the beginnings of our paintings. And we are trying to turn that list into sort of like a script in order to have more pieces to question the direction of our sketches and our drawings, so we can have the strongest possible beginning, because those things are completely overlooked, and then sometimes the success of a painting relies on precisely the arranging within a format. So no mixing color alchemy today, but equally important. Again, we're just going to revisit 5 or 6 questions, critique um, things, I guess. And I'll bring 3 examples. Hi, Jen. How are you? Sorry, she's
Sorry.
laughing.
You know how it is when your arrow's like on the total other side of
I
the computer
know. I
and you're
shouldn't
like,
do
oh,
this to
wait,
you.
no, it's great. I'm great. I'm good. Hello.
Thanks. No, I bring you up because you put the questions in the recap notes, and sometimes, always, I revisit those notes in order to see if there's something that we could just continue talking about, because when we're painting, everything goes very fast. And so thank you for those notes. The 5 questions are there. And
My pleasure, friend.
thanks. And what I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna show you the 3 paintings that we're gonna talk about. So this will be examples that we used when we did the Roofless Dog and Pony show throughout art history. And I wanted to, yeah, this is the first one. Let me just share this and see if we, yeah. So again, this is one of my favorite pieces of the images that we brought, showing different styles about still life with flowers, of a French, Lithuanian, Jewish French artist that we had no idea about, Pinkus Cremeigne. Anyhow, so I'm just going to go down the list of the 5 things, and then we're just going to use this visual to actually find out how the artist did it. The first one, it's the balance used in the composition. When we just go in every sketch, this is something that we completely overlook. What kind of balance we want in the composition, if there is an intentional symmetry in the composition, or there is also an avoidance of that balance. And yeah, uh, exactly. Yeah. So balance and equilibrium and intention. So here, as an example, the composition is very balanced. The focal point is in the middle, and there's no intention to create any strange cropping. There's no, yeah, there's no compositional element that is directing the view, or the eyes of the viewer to um, an invitation to recreate space. Because sometimes with cropping, with balance that, or compositions that are intentionally unbalanced, there's a reason for them. It's not random. Sometimes the cropping is sort of like a hand, a holding hand that's pulling us to discover a space in the composition, or a direction towards a different part of the composition. So balance and unbalance are elements, compositional elements, that I think we should put on top of our list of criteria to consider when we transfer um, objects from live onto our format. I'm going to go to the other two examples that I wanted to talk about. There's this one right here, Ion or Ion Pacea, Romanian. So again, intentionally balanced. There's the focal point that it's floating or anchored on this square. There is balance within balance. There's an area that is a little bit off balance, and it kind of like pulls the composition towards one side. And this is masterfully placed because then the light direction is giving us a cast shadow on the other side. So there is balance within the non-equilibrium. Um, just trying to see if we can just put this vocabulary and word in our minds, because sometimes we just do it. There's no thought process behind it. We just kind of like start, put the charcoal on, and then we do it. So um, just think about that when we do a new painting, and what kind of intention compositionally you want to achieve. And finally, just going to bring this image right here. So even though we may say that there is also a very balanced composition, I feel like the vase is really moved to the bottom of the painting. So there's an approach to that very dangerous magnetic side of the format. There's a tilt on the line. There's dark versus lighter on the background. And there is an intention to balance that composition with written letters on the right. And then there is something right here that I'm not sure. I think it's a signature. There's an object right here. What do you think it is, Jen?
I don't know.
I cannot make it bigger, but definitely it's something
Yeah.
that stands out over the table.
Right. I was going to say a rock, but that doesn't make sense. There'd be a random rock on the table.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Anyhow, so the object right here, it's not very sharp or visible, but it creates sort of like a pool or a seesaw between the heavy white empty space and then this object right here, almost aligned. But there's definitely a little bit of an unbalance, if you ask me, with this composition. And perhaps the best example, I'm just gonna was gonna just talk about three, but I just wanted to bring, if I may, um, I don't think oh my gosh, I don't think. Let me see if I can bring Elizabeth Payton's. Um, yeah, I'm gonna bring Elizabeth Payton's. For some reason, they're not on the. Yeah, for some reason they're not there. So I'll just drop them here really quickly. I don't know where they went. But yeah, perfect example of unbalanced composition. Ooh, nice. Let me see. Okay, here we go. So zoomed in, cropped. There's space underneath. I love the position over the face of the book or the box. But look how it's cropped and it's off center. The axis line, it's not right on the center. And then there is idea of a corner that it's on the other side. Another example of unbalanced composition, off center, also involving a portrait behind it. I love this. And then the flowers completely occupy the upper part. Very contemporary, very modern, a very good example on an unbalanced composition. This one as well, uh, more of an open space on the left, and then there's more texture on the right, and also there's an imbalance in temperature, color temperature. So yeah, let's go down to number two. And I'm just gonna bring back this painting again. We're gonna do this with 5 points. The second one was, does the composition contain activity in different spatial planes? Have foreground, middle ground, and background been addressed? So this is a very interesting element as well. It's, I love that it goes down this way, because balance has to do with the actual format of the painting, how you arrange things inside. But once you have decided what kind of balance or unbalance you want on your composition, then you can go and decide what kind of like depth, visual planes equal depth, perspective. And even though this is not a landscape, it's not a bad idea to try to articulate the different elements that go from closer to the viewer to further away. And in that sense, so what we've got here, it's a clear split between surface and background. There's no other visual plane beyond that. The background visual plane occupies more than 50% of the composition. And then I feel like the elements, this is a very simple, the elements are aligned on the same visual plane. That's number one. And number two, they're not on, in front of each other by any or behind, which it also reduces the illusion of depth. So very daring and really interesting because just bringing one of the objects in front would have created a much more interesting or dynamic perspective when you block something visually or you hide something visually. These are tricks, and they are things that we should consider if we have the power to arrange objects and paint them from life. Example of very simple visual plane organization: background, surface, one plane only. I'm going to go with the same premise, and I will just go to this area right here, visual planes. This is like also in a very similar way. We have the same composition in regards of like maybe the split between um, surface and background is not as uneven as before. There's no room behind it. There's no window. There's no light. There's nothing that indicates that this is a space or even a wall. There's only this line. So the visual planes are flattened. And also the addition of the color being very similar, it's a way of flatten that perspective. So what I find really interesting about talking about these five elements applied to visual examples is that I come to the realization that there's nothing right or wrong. There's nothing better or worse. It's just about intention. And to me, being aware that these elements may contribute to the power of decide artistically how I want to arrange things within a format. It gives me more control, and it also gives me more enjoyment, I would say. So very simple background, and then again the elements in a very similar way, but you'll see here a couple of things. Number one, there is an object that is in front of another object. So these two peaches, what it seems peaches right here, the fact that one is blocking the other, one is behind the one in the foreground, creates perspective. So always think perspective is not just vanishing points and diagonal lines. It could be done with many tricks. So this is a good example of, in a very simple way, uh, forward and behind. Same thing with the flowers. So we have three white spots that are isolated and they're sort of like not grouped together. And then we have these two that they have almost as very similar grouping as the peaches. One on the front, one on the back. They almost follow the same um, axis or uh, orderly placement, if you will. I love also the fact that they are placed and they kind of like follow that side of the napkin or the tablecloth. So this may completely be unnoticed by someone who's looking at this painting. But I think as artists, it's important to go over these details, whether the artist wanted to do this or not. That's not our concern, or we shouldn't care. But I feel like I do like to find these little Easter eggs, since this weekend's going to be Easter, I guess, like we can use that within the painting. There's also another example here, or front and behind, of front and behind. This flower, it's covering the opening of the jug. So flat perspective, no spatial background, but the idea of blocking one object really creates a little bit more of an illusion. So notice that both are very simple, these two paintings. This one doesn't have that much illusion of perspective. There's something else different here that comes into play, the use of color and the gray and the muddy tones, obviously. But even in the flowers, there's not a sense of anything covering that much, perhaps some of the elements. Um, so what makes these two paintings different, it's not so much the colors and the style, but the organization of the composition. And that's what I like to refer to when we start a painting. Be very mindful and conscious how you want to arrange it, because we feel like style is everything, detail is everything. These things are important. This painting is simpler, but it just creates more of an idea of like perspective than this one right here that feels more worked, I guess. And finally, this one right here, the John Singer Sargent, foreground, middle ground, background. There's a little bit more of a sense of a spatial or depth in the background. So this doesn't feel like a wall. So certainly there is an intention of treating this more as open space or a spatial context. So even though we may think that the artist just unconsciously painted this from darker to lighter, there is an intention. Sometimes we're not able to articulate that intention, but definitely this is not just a flat wall. So there is this sense of the visual plane of the background treated in a way that counterbalances the flatness and the gray of the smooth finish of the surface. And then with the bouquet of roses, there is this idea of the roses blocking the object. So if you make an effort to sort of like isolate everything else, even squinting your eyes, this illusion or this trick creates an illusion of not only of volume, but of flowers really coming forward, popping outside of the painting. People say, you know what, these flowers look alive. And sometimes we are confused because we don't know how to do that. Well, blocking objects or creating or hiding elements could help us bring that idea of visual planes. So yeah, that was my third example. So composition containing activity and different spatial planes, foreground, middle ground, and background, how we address those. So I'm gonna go to the third, and I think I have time. I'm gonna cut it until 30 minutes tops. Let me see if I can do that. Going back to this painting, the third question is about do objects or elements in your composition occupy the foreground, the middle ground, and the background? I think we talked during the webinar about these two questions, number two and number three, being pretty much very similar. So I think I'm just going to jump because we already talked about that, and not only the spatial planes, but also how the objects are organized in the spatial planes. So I think we just did both in one. And I think I'm just going to move forward to number four. Maybe we can just talk about a couple more that we didn't talk about during the Friday webinar. Has attention been given to both positive and negative space? Has the arrangement of objects and or positive space resulted in some interesting negative spaces? Well, we have a lot to talk about in that sense, applied to three visual examples. This is about the difference between positive space and negative space. This has nothing to do about balance. So I think we can close that chapter. And this has nothing to do about foreground, middle ground, and background. Negative space defined as the non-tangible space around the forms that have physicality, if you will. So let's just analyze that, because I feel like sometimes we just put everything together in the same hairball, and we don't know what's visual plane or perspective or negative space is and how we should address it. I feel like breaking it down into these categories, hopefully it's going to be helpful. So how did this artist address the negative space, the non-tangible? So there's not a compartmentalization. It's not very compartmentalized. It occupies a lot of the composition. I know we talked a little bit about the visual plane. I mean, the background doing that. So negative space has the same colors as the subject, or the focal point rather, I'm sorry. So they are painted with the same style. So there's not a major contrast distinction between negative space and positive space. there's a sense of the focal point, or the negative, I mean, the positive space, almost becoming part of the negative space. So there is an intention here of continuation. There's an intention here of non-differentiation, whether it's conscious or unconscious, but definitely the negative space is treated with physicality here. It's not just a frame or a backdrop that supports and defines or delineates the focal point. It becomes a pictorial plane. The negative space is a pictorial plane. This is painted. This is also painted with strokes. So, a very interesting approach to addressing the difference and the relationship between positive space and negative space. And let's just go back to our second example, which is the Pachea example, negative space versus positive space. Okay, so we can recognize the positive space being the physical objects, the tangible, the illusion of tangible objects. So there is a clear contrast between that and the treatment of the negative space. There is a flat, even, solid, saturated background that occupies, and I like to use this word because I think it applies here, occupies the entire format. And what it does, it very strongly defines and determines the focal point, which is the positive space. So again, the relationship or the distinction between positive and negative here, plenty of space, a lot of movement. We talked about movement and how it means distance between the negative and the positive space, and how the positive space is defined by the blocking of the negative space around it. So it is not treated as a pictorial plane. It is treated as a graphic anchoring uh, foundational point. Um, yeah, so I think I'm just going to go to the third painting example. Positive space, let's recognize it. It's just the vase and the roses, and also this is positive space, this object, glasses, signature, petals falling from the rose, perhaps.
Yeah, that's
Um,
what Laura said. She thinks it's petals, and that sounds great. Yeah.
oh, yeah.
Sorry, Julio. Yeah.
No, no, no. It's, yeah. I mean, now that I see it again, it's funny how we don't see things at the very beginning. But yeah, so yeah, positive space versus negative space. So the negative space here occupies a lot. It just also defines the positive space, and there is a sense of integration, I would say. Positive space versus negative space, the edges are not super sharp, especially here there's a diffusion, for example. So yeah, treat it as a pictorial plane, again, especially here, underdeveloped. There's no interest in making this clear or recognizable. There's this spill of gray against the background that would make someone with OCD go nuts, because what's this? Why is not the black right there? These are the things that I really make move me about paintings, because you can see this, and then flowers, roses, it's beautiful. Next, but then spending a little bit of time and then just recognizing that the brilliance it's in the disorganization, in the unsettling of how things are positioned. This gray, why this gray? It's like just right there, and it's just a spill from the counter, and perhaps this softens this area right here, because if the black would have been, if the negative space would have been really close to here, this would have taken too much protagonism. So I feel like the way John Singer Sargent treated the negative space here, it just gave a lot of room. So there's a continuation. I said pictorial plane, I said definition, I guess, on the second example. And this is continuation. This negative space makes us want to imagine what, or that this actually continues outside of this frame or this format or those edges. So I'm gonna go to
Julio,
And
before you move on,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but just to clarify, this painting is John Singer Sargent or is it Cerula?
this is John Singer Sargent. Oh, Sorolla, my gosh. Jen,
I
thank you.
just wanted to make sure, yeah, it's clear. I went back and forth, and Amanda pointed that out too. So
Okay,
just for
thanks,
our
guys.
listeners to make sure. Sure, sure.
Perfect. Sorolla, yes. Equally amazing. But yeah, let's just be um, correct. But thank you, thanks. I had it like hiding, and for some reason this screamed John Singer. But I'm sorry, John Singer Sargent. I didn't mean to
It's
offend you.
amazing that you remember so many things. So I think we can forgive you.
Oh my gosh. Thanks, friend. Or yeah, okay. So let's just go to the fifth element. So we just put together number two and number three, and then we talked again to recap balance, visual planes, and arrangement of objects in visual planes as a single category, positive and negative space, and how it has been addressed, the relationship between them, if it's meant to define, if it's meant to continue, if it's meant to integrate, if it's meant to be an extension of the pictorial plane. There are different options, but it's nice to see different examples. Sometimes when I read these things or when someone tells me these things and I don't have a visual example in front of me that I could just apply that and contrast it with um, an actual painting, I just cannot make any use of it. It's just very hard for me. So yeah, number five, um, have the objects in your composition been grouped in varied and interesting ways? Are there smaller compositions within the larger compositions? And I just wrote in the book grouping, how what's the grouping and the relationship between the objects. So maybe we could just jump from negative to positive to how the positive space has been addressed, the actual positive space, not just the relationship between them. Oops. So the grouping right here obviously goes back to a little bit, it touches on the visual plane. The objects are not touching each other. There's a space between them. There's nothing hiding. So yeah, there's a little bit of balance, and they're not even touching the line in the background. But addressing the actual composition, there is a composition within the composition, and it's sort of like the bouquet of flowers. And we're gonna just see this in the rest of the examples. But yeah, this room or space between the objects is very interesting because it just accentuates the idea of isolation, maybe, or non-contact. So I like the combination of the balanced composition with the fact that the objects are not close to each other. There's more of a focal point on the flowers, perhaps. Let's just go back to this painting right here really quickly and then analyze how the objects are arranged. Definitely, there are three main groups. And again, the word here is grouping. So they're grouped by shape and by color. So the grouping of the peaches, obviously, they're on their own. They are part of, but they're not attached to. There's an intention there. There's a reason why the artist didn't want to gang them up together with a vase. Then there are the flowers, which are occupying a specific location in the painting. And they are related with each other in different ways because even though they have the same size, they have different orientations. And finally, the anchoring point of the flowers, the vase. So there is a specific grouping in which two groups are attached, one is detached. So and when you think of the Sorolla painting, when you think of your composition, especially with still lifes, think of what you want grouped together. Think of how do you want to, what kind of a relationship you want to establish between the elements of your still life. Do you want isolation? Do you want congregation? Do you want detachment? Do you want crowding? So all these sub categories within the grouping are important. I love the detachment between the written letters and the petals. There's something really intentionally poetic about that. And not to mention that conceptually, this brings a really sober tone to the composition. But we're not talking about concept. We can just do that in a different, but yeah, thinking of I'm going to talk a little bit because I love this so much. I love the beauty of the flowers. Is this a love letter? Is this um, uh, breakup missive? I don't know. The tragic and the beautiful, perhaps. And there's a petal on the ground, so these flowers are not fresh. So that's my mind already just running with it. But the grouping here has an intention. So yeah, and then just gonna go to finally the bonus one, the one that we didn't talk. 'Cause they're starting to become a little bit more abstract, but yeah, has overlapping been used in your composition? If not, why not? What does overlapping indicate? I think we can just use the number 5 and number 6 grouping and overlapping in the same category. Let's move to number 7. Are there objects of varying size and character, or are all objects roughly the same size? Are there both regular and irregular shapes, or objects represented in your composition? This is a big one. So I just grouped together the grouping and the overlapping just because I feel like it's within the same category, but this is a different narrative. The size, extremely important. The relationship between the objects could be addressed by the idea of grouping, but it could be addressed by the relationship between um, strictly size. What's big, what's small? Are we going to make something bigger if we put something smaller? Think of paintings that you've done before in which you may have had like something that feels way too similar. The tendency is to just make everything the same size. I'll tell you that. So I think it's important to bring this conversation when we do the next still life and see what do we want to achieve with the size relationship, the regular irregular shapes. So this feels size wise. I don't know. There's definitely a height on the vase, but there's a certain regularity between the objects in the composition. We're not talking about negative space. I'm talking about positive space. Let's just go back here, and there's an element introduced in this composition, and perhaps we could just talk about this now, even though it possibly belongs to a different category. The addition of the napkin within the space. So this is a surface within a surface, and yeah, it just creates and maybe the overlapping that we mentioned earlier or before, this kind of like applies here. But in regards to the size, I see this as an object now. I see this as a larger element within this almost at the negative space, and then everything inside it, it's a little bit small. So relationship of sizes, very important when you do paintings. The wider the spectrum, the more you're going to retain maybe the attention of the viewer. And Sorolla right here, clearly there is a rhythm. If you ask me, there's a rhythm between the 1, 2, 3, 4 elements, 5, 6 elements. I'm just going to describe the rhythm and then we're just going to close it here. Flowers being the largest on the positive space, the vase being a little bit smaller, the letters just continuing or being a little bit smaller, and finally this sort of like a smaller unit. So I see a rhythmic decrease in sizes within the composition or the grouping or the arrangement of positive space. And then I said, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I said 5 and 6. 5 being the surface, so that's even larger than everything else, and then 6, although it's negative space, being the background. So I love this kind of like rhythmic. There's nothing that it's equal. I think that's what's important. Just to recap this category, we tend to make them sizes the same period. So try to bring an intention about variations of sizes, occupying more space, and being a little bit smaller. Especially in landscapes, this works very well. But I feel like in still lives it really shines, because otherwise we think of this the fruits having the same size. Maybe they have this the different color, but why do they have to be the same size? This is a perfect example. So just gonna stop right here. Again, we've gone down 7 categories, and hopefully this was a good presentation with visual examples of what it means when we talk about spatial or compositional criteria and questions we should ask every time from the minute we lay the charcoal on our painting. I'm going to stop the recording. Thanks, everyone.